The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus is about to embark on his world-shattering voyage to the Americas. And on his way to the coast, he stops off here at Granada. He's the honoured guest of a ceremony hosted by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. They are celebrating a grand victory. Up until this day, Granada had been ruled by Muslims. But Isabella has managed to wrestle control from them.
Ferdinand and Isabella's victory marks a turning point for Spain and for Europe. The Middle Ages are over, and the West is about to embark on a new epoch of power and discovery.
We tend to think of this as the beginning of an era. In fact, it's the climax of a forgotten chapter in European history: the rise and fall of Islam in the West. It was Rudyard Kipling who wrote, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." And it's a worldview that still has currency today. Islam and Christianity seem to have become ideological monoliths, citadels whose gates are firmly closed to one another. But they haven't always lived such separate lives. In the year 711 AD, Muslim forces invaded Spain and created a society so rich and so powerful it was the envy of the known world. This wasn't the rigid, ferocious Islam of our imaginations, but a progressive, sensuous, intellectually curious culture that for a number of spine-tingling years looked set to sweep through the whole of Europe. It is an incredible story, but one that has been systematically written out of history.
After the Catholic monarchs took over the city of Granada, they began to destroy all evidence that the Muslims had ever been in Spain. In the following century, the Spanish authorities persecuted and expelled 300,000 Muslims and burned as many as 1 million Arabic books. This was an astonishing act of ethnic cleansing. It put an end to a civilization which had flourished in Spain for 700 years. These people have become known as the Moors.
Propaganda, sparked by the Crusades, has given us an enduring image: the diabolical Moor, a dark-skinned, savage, alien enemy.
But this character is a complete invention and tells us nothing about who these people really were. Now, archaeologists and historians are starting to piece together the real story of the Moors in Spain. They're uncovering the remains of hidden cities, discovering the role of Muslims in the revival of the classics, and decoding the meaning of Islamic buildings. A fascinating picture has emerged.
I'm going to use this new research to explore what happened when East met West in Europe.
If there is one place which challenges the stereotype of the treacherous, bloodthirsty Moor, it's here, the Alhambra Palace in Granada. The Alhambra is one of the most complete medieval Islamic palaces in the whole world. It was built by the Muslim kings of Granada in the 14th century, at the height of their power. Its name means the red one, because the dark surrounding soil has given its stones an earthy reddish hue. The marvel of the Alhambra is its mystery. Not a single account of life here survives. All its archives were incinerated in the fires of the Inquisition.
But the Catholics couldn't bring themselves to destroy this place. The Alhambra is one of the wonders of the medieval world. And by preserving it, they've kept a box of secrets that we can use to decode the civilization that built it.
Inside the palace walls, the architecture is breathtaking.
Although the aesthetic of this courtyard is quite cool and minimal now, in its heyday, it would have been a riot of colour. Granada was very famous for producing silks, and you've had silk hangings billowing in the breeze, and silk cushions and silk rugs where people laid out to eat their dinner and to listen to music. And in fact, it's only when you get down to rug level that you appreciate one of the bits of magic of the place, because from down here, this pool acts like a kind of infinity mirror, and the whole of the palace just looks as if it's suspended in water.
Every detail of the palace decoration seems to be part of a scheme. Row upon row of intricate geometric patterns are carved into the woodwork of the walls and windows.
This is the throne room. It was the symbolic centre of the palace, and here the Sultan had a kind of psychological advantage over his subjects. Whereas he'd have stood here, an eerie silhouette, they'd have been blinded by the light that came streaming in through these brightly coloured stained glass windows.
The 19th century writer Washington Irving observed,
"It's impossible to contemplate this abode of Oriental manners without feeling the early association of Arabian romance. One almost expects to see some dark eye sparkling through the lattice. The abode of beauty is here, as if it had been inhabited but yesterday."
But this is far more than just a beautiful building. There's a specific reason why it feels so harmonious. The men who built it had a knowledge of complex geometry which had originated in the ancient world. The first man to set down these mathematical principles was the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Pythagoras saw numbers everywhere in the universe, but his brilliance was to understand the importance of the ratio between them.
Professor Antonio Fernandez Puertas has spent his life studying the Alhambra. He's discovered that the whole of the building, from the ground plan to the wall decoration, is based around one single ratio.
I think everything is so perfect because everything is under control of the proportion and very, very simple. You notice that there is something magic about these buildings. There is something marvelous in your surroundings.
It's very, very simple. It's the relation between the ground and the elevations of the buildings. It's as simple as that.
The king ordered a new palace. He has a limited area to build the palace. To west, east, and south, he was limited. Then he did something ingenious and beautiful.
The King of Granada asked his architects to harmonise each and every space within the palace according to a single set of proportions, a family of rectangles, each related to the other.
If you want to get proportional rectangle, you have the same base. Take the diagonal, put it up,
Yes?
and you got successive rectangle, proportional rectangle.
The key to the Alhambra's design is the simple relationship between the side of a square and its diagonal. If we use the diagonal to make a rectangle, and then the diagonal from that rectangle to make another, we get a progression of rectangles. The fourth rectangle is double the size of the first, and the diagonals in this sequence are in fact the square roots of 2, 3, 4 and 5. A magical sequence.
And are they doing all this just with 2 set squares and a piece of string?
Yes.
That's very clever.
Yes.
Every part of the intricate network of spaces, all the courtyards, the hallways, the placement of every column was designed using inspired variations of this proportional system.
Proportion is also in the elevation. You have the kiosk. Here you build a square, and with the diagonal, you swing it up.
Nothing violated this incredibly elaborate system. The Alhambra is a triumph of mathematics as much as it is of aesthetics. Mathematical ingenuity is the root of its beauty.
But no one talks about this. Everyone looks at the Alhambra just as an aesthetic experience.
When you go to a concert and you listen to Mozart, you listen Beethoven, you listen Verdi, you don't know perhaps music, but you notice that there is something magic.
Yes.
It happens with that the same. You feel it.
The Alhambra is so enchanting. It's all too easy to view it as a fairy tale palace, isolated from history. But that is romantic nonsense. This palace was the product of a very real, very gritty history. The Alhambra was built by a religious empire which, at the pinnacle of its power, dominated land from China to Africa. An empire which had the wealth and intellect to build such masterpieces. An empire whose history goes back to the deserts of 7th century Arabia. The Alhambra was the creation of the richest, most intellectually powerful civilization in the world. The roots of this cultural and religious explosion lie not in Spain, but in the deserts of Arabia. At the beginning of the 7th century in Saudi Arabia, something happened which was to change the religious makeup of the world forever. A merchant called Muhammad asserted that he had been visited by the Archangel Gabriel, who had revealed to him the true words of God. These revelations, which came to Muhammad throughout his life, became known as the Quran. And the religion was Islam.
This was a time when people were experimenting with all sorts of cults and religions, many of which fell by the wayside. But the Prophet Muhammad and his followers made an important move. They travelled to a desert oasis where they founded a city called Medina.
With a foothold in Medina, Islam was no longer just a nomadic desert cult. It had an urban centre with a social structure. As the religion grew bigger, so it grew more ambitious.
Territorial expansion was a characteristic of nomadic Arabs well before the arrival of Muhammad. Tribal leaders would initiate razzia, or raids, on their neighbours. And with the advent of Islam, these gained some kind of spiritual significance. This is what one commander was reported to have said in one of the earliest ever Arabic chronicles. "This land is your inheritance and the promise of your Lord. You've been tasting it and eating from it. You have been killing its people and taking them into captivity. You are Arab chiefs and notables. If you renounce this world and aspire to the hereafter, God will give you this world and the hereafter." They believed they were inspired by the power of God.
Within decades, Islamic Arabs had reached as far as Persia in the east. In the west, they'd conquered Egypt, Jordan, and much of North Africa and were within spitting distance of Europe. But Islam wasn't only interested in territorial expansion. It was also a faith committed to the pursuit of learning. Among the Prophet's first revelations was the instruction, seek knowledge.
No.
This meant that from the very earliest days of Islam, literacy and religious study went hand in hand. Whereas a number of other religions of the day preferred to keep literacy the privilege of a clerical elite, Islam actively encouraged it. In the ancient Muslim city of Fez in Morocco, there are many examples of this unique integration of religion and education.
This is the Karouin Mosque in Fez, and it's still the heart of religious life here. It was founded in 859 by a woman, both as a religious and as an educational establishment.
Mosques were used for teaching grammar and literacy to ordinary people. In time, colleges, known as madrasas, were set up. This is the madrasa Bu Inania. Its walls are covered with the rich, rhyming prose of the Quran.
The mosque is only part of the complex, which contains both it and the madrasa. When the Sultan Abu Anan founded the place, he built the mosque alongside the madrasa. It is most symbolic. The mosque, built for prayer, was also a place which encouraged education and learning. As you can see, there is no separation. When the Quran was given to the Prophet who was illiterate, the angel told him, read. These inscriptions carved onto the walls are verses of poetry and can be found throughout the madrasa. But I think the most important section is here. What it says in Arabic is, I am the apogee of knowledge. Come, you Muslims. Come and learn, because with knowledge you can become what you want to be in the future. During the medieval period, knowledge was high on the agenda in the Islamic world. Muslim societies produced many books in the various spheres of knowledge, and these books came to be known worldwide.
It wasn't just an enlightened attitude to reading which placed learning at the heart of the Islamic world. Necessity was also the mother of invention.
Because the Arabs were nomads and desert traders who often had to travel in the cool of the night, they were well versed in using the stars as guiding devices. This developed into a very sophisticated study of astronomy. Then with the establishment of Islam, that knowledge was applied in a new way. Whenever a mosque was built, the prayer niche had to be orientated in direct relation to Mecca, and there were a number of religious festivals that had to fall on certain days in the lunar year.
These were complex mathematical problems for which the Muslims devised precise solutions. Islam became a culture which naturally embraced scientific and mathematical investigation. This uninhibited attitude towards learning meant that when Muslims encountered the teachings of other cultures, they seized upon them vigorously. In the very early days of Islam, Muslims came into contact with a body of knowledge which had been ignored by most of Northern Europe for centuries. The works of the ancient Greeks.
It's once you look at a globe that it becomes particularly easy to understand why the Arabs were such natural inheritors of Greek learning. From the Bronze Age onwards, there'd been a constant exchange of artifacts and information all across the Eastern Mediterranean. And in fact, a number of Greek ideas stem from Eastern and Egyptian influences. The bulk of this knowledge was preserved in the great schools and library at Alexandria. And then in 641 AD, the Arabs take over the city and, at a stroke, have direct access to this precious learning.
Many of these texts found their way to Fez. This is an Arabic translation of Aristotle with an additional commentary by the Muslim scholar Averroes.
The translation's done in Iraq, and then Averroes does this commentary in Al-Andalus.
There's even an early Arabic translation of the Bible.
So it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Arabic's the lingua franca, and everybody's writing in Arabic, even the Bible.
And thus ends the Gospel of Mark the Apostle.
The contrast with Europe at this time could not have been greater. Here, ancient Greek texts and the rational investigation they contained were often feared as blasphemous.
When the Prophet Muhammad was born, Christianity had already been battling with paganism for 600 years, trying to persuade believers to turn away from their old gods to the one new God. And because of that, Christians were often suspicious of Greek and Roman pagan texts. For instance, in 529 AD, the Christian emperor Justinian closed down the Athenian schools of philosophy.
Set against this vibrant Islamic culture, Europe can appear an introspective and intellectually cautious place. It was certainly a continent in crisis.
After the fall of Rome, there was a power vacuum in Europe, with rival tribes squabbling for territories. It was the start of what later Christian scholars would describe as the Dark Ages.
While Europe lay unprotected and vulnerable, Islam was consolidating land and power. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs had converted the Berber tribes at the very tip of North Africa. And before long, troops were gathered on the coast, their eyes fixed on Europe.
This little stretch of water between Spain and Morocco is only 9 miles wide, but it's come to represent some kind of cultural chasm between Europe and Africa. But in the 8th century, when sea travel was the way to get around, that wasn't a barrier, it was a highway.
In July 711, 7,000 Berber tribesmen stormed across the Straits of Gibraltar and invaded Europe. The Muslims then began an incredible process of expansion. In just 4 years, they'd colonised almost the whole of Spain, had crossed the Pyrenees, and were only halted at Poitiers in France. Were it not for this reverse, an army which had swept across 2 continents might easily have crossed the English Channel and occupied Britain. The Muslims called the country they came to Al-Andalus, the land of the Vandals. This refers to the Germanic tribe who ruled Spain at the time, the Visigoths. Spanish historians have traditionally seen the Muslim invasion of Spain as a terrible and violent attack, an assault on Christian Europe. In fact, here at the Visigothic site of Rocopolis near Madrid, archaeologists have found evidence which offers a rather different explanation.
The city of Rocopolis, in fact, was the royal city founded by the Visigoths in order to demonstrate the power of the new state. Dimensions were spectacular for this period. And this complex is the most important discovery in Western Europe.
What was it at the time that the Muslims were invading? What was the state of the city then?
They found it not only here in this part of Iberia, but in everywhere of the Al-Andalus. They founded cities in crisis. Social crisis, of urban crisis. The traditional explanation is this idea that when the Arabs came, the society collapses and the city collapses. It's not true. It's not true. The collapse of the city started during the Visigothic period.
If you read the Orthodox Spanish histories, then you'll learn that predatory Muslim hordes forcibly appropriated Visigothic Spain. And there certainly were some invasion battles. But at many places, like here at Recopolis, it seems that the newcomers were actually welcomed with open arms. We even have treaties where the Visigoths enthusiastically hand over their land in return for effective Muslim protection. When you were excavating, did you find any evidence of violence at the time of the Arab invasion?
We don't have evidence of violence. Not at all. In this area was peaceful, and the archaeology is showing another landscape, another explanation too. The Muslims started to build a new society.
The enthusiasm for learning that the Islamic world had spent years nurturing was about to be transmitted to Europe.
We went into Spain not to fight against the people there, but to save them from the tyranny of the Latins and others that governed them at the time. In Al-Andalus, they found a paradise on earth. When the Arabs changed location, changed geography from their inhospitable, barren homeland, and moved to a rich and fertile country, this was to transform the Arab mind. This is the secret of how such a great civilization came to be born.
The foundations of a new society had been laid. A self-confident, progressive and sophisticated civilization had arrived among the failing states of Europe. And the continent's history was about to be transformed. The Muslim invasion of Spain had been swift and effective, but it lacked a strong leadership. The first wave of invaders were North African tribesmen, only recently converted to Islam, and without connections to the power base of Arabia. But this was about to change. In the capital of the Muslim world, a political coup left all the members of the ruling dynasty massacred. All that is except for one, a prince called Abd al-Rahman.
Abd al-Rahman was in his late teens when his family was massacred. He managed to escape the slaughter and fled to the hills west of Damascus.
His mother had been from North Africa, and Abd al-Rahman must have grown up hearing tales of Al-Andalus. And so he made a dangerous journey across the Nile and the deserts of Egypt, heading for those distant lands. Abd al-Rahman brought culture and learning from the centre of the Islamic world straight to the heart of Al-Andalus.
When Abd al-Rahman arrived in Spain, he came here to Cordoba, where the city was in complete disarray. That Roman bridge had collapsed into the river. But Abd al-Rahman set to rebuilding the city. You have to remember that it's in this context that the Arabs arrive, not as marauding destroyers, but sometimes as saviours.
Abd ar-Rahman brought cutting-edge technology for irrigation to Spain. Almost immediately, the landscape was transformed. Palm trees, lemon and orange groves, avocados, artichokes and pomegranates, none of which had been seen in Europe. Because of Abd ar-Rahman's sophisticated trade network, this new agriculture created huge wealth. And these riches were used to build one of the greatest cities in the world. While the inhabitants of London were still living in wooden houses, the people of Cordoba had built a cosmopolitan city with a population of over 100,000, the largest settlement in Europe. Reports from European visitors to Cordoba describe a city with 70 libraries and over 300 public baths. The accounts tell of houses with running water and roads illuminated by streetlights.
You often have to take medieval sources with a fairly substantial pinch of salt because chroniclers were extremely fond of exaggeration. But in fact, the new excavations here at Cordoba are actually revealing a city that was just as rich as the one that they described. These monumental palace walls belong to a Muslim aristocrat, and this channel over here is part of the water system that brought Cordoba its famously effective sewage works, as well as the fountains and the baths that so impressed all those European visitors.
Cordoba was described by a 10th century German visitor as the ornament of the world.
One of the reasons it's been so difficult to investigate Islamic Cordoba is that the city's been built up on itself like a kind of layer cake. But here, the archaeologists have taken away the modern level to reveal that Islamic layer there, and then down at the bottom, a Roman mosaic.
Abd ar-Rahman built Cordoba on top of what had been one of the largest cities in Roman Spain, outshining all that went before. And his greatest achievement was this: the Great Mosque of Cordoba. With a floor space the size of 4 football pitches, this is the largest mosque in Western Islam. The forest of 600 marble columns disappear into the distance, creating a mesmeric infinity effect. On the columns, arches balance on top of one another. Its shell-shaped prayer niche has an extraordinary acoustic, making any word spoken inside audible to the entire congregation.
When the mosque was first built, these archways would have been opened to allow people and light to stream in and out. And this courtyard was a central part of the complex. People would come here to ritually purify themselves before they worshipped, or just to gossip and do business.
Abd ar-Rahman's original mosque was only a fraction of the size of the building that stands today. Over a period of 200 years, rulers would extend the mosque 3 times. It's been suggested that the mosque was enlarged because each new ruler of the city wanted to stamp his authority on the building. But there's also a more straightforward explanation. The Cordoba Mosque had to accommodate the burgeoning number of worshippers. the Muslim population of Spain was growing fast. Modern Spain has been reluctant to acknowledge that its indigenous population converted to Islam in droves.
Standard history books present the Muslim occupation of Spain as something that was superficial, just a surface colonisation by an Arab elite, not a presence that had any kind of lasting impact on the bulk of the population. New archaeological evidence is turning that idea on its head.
All over Spain, cities like Cordoba were established. Even Madrid was founded by Muslims. The original Arab walls still stand behind the royal palace.
How far did Muslim communities spread through Spain?
We see remains dating from the time of the Al-Andalus almost everywhere, not only in the south of Spain, but also in other parts of Spain. There are emerging lots of sites, fortresses, villages, and cities, almost everywhere. People were Arabized, losing the form of Latin they were speaking until then, and they were Islamized in the sense that they dropped Christianity and converted to Islam in massive numbers, really.
Were these forced conversions, or was the idea of Islam particularly attractive?
It's always very difficult to say why someone converts to another religion, isn't it? But I think there's no evidence of any forced conversion at all. In a way, the Islamization and Arabization of territories like Al-Andalus is very similar to what happened to the Roman Empire, when people wanted to convert to the values and to the cultural values, to the religious values, and to the way of living of what seemed to be a civilization which had lots of advantages.
I think it's very easy to forget that at this moment in time, Islam is a culture of innovation, isn't it? As you said, it's drawing in ideas from the East.
It's a culture of phenomenal innovation. The opportunities of living because of the market, because of the trade relations and so on, which were much more interesting.
The Islamization of Spain did more than change the name of the god that people worshipped. People converted because this was a religion which had something to offer them. It had wealth, it had social structure, and it had intellectual power.
The Arabs brought in one innovation that did more than any other to change the cultural makeup of Europe. And it's this: paper. The idea almost certainly came from the Chinese via trade exchange, and it is revolutionary technology. Unlike parchment and vellum, it's cheap and it's easy to mass produce. And when the Arabs come to Spain, they start to open paper-making factories. Paper allows you to do three things very effectively. You can gather information, you can analyse and develop ideas in a very precise way, and then you can disseminate your newfound knowledge to a wider world. And in the 10th century, that was a potent mix.
Cordoba's love of books became legendary. Whilst the Royal Library of France contained 900 books in this period, just one of Cordoba's 70 libraries amassed over 500,000. These books contain some of the most sophisticated studies of astronomy in the world.
In Northern Europe at this time there is nothing, but there is nothing that can be considered the result of sophisticated astronomy.
Why do you think Muslim scholars were particularly interested in the heavens and the revolution of the stars?
I think they were interested in science in general terms. For example, calculating the sacred direction. If you have to say your prayers, you must face towards Mecca. Calculating the direction of Mecca from a given place is not so easy. It is a complicated mathematical problem for which the Arabs had exact solutions from the 9th century.
One of the ways in which the Muslims solved these problems was by developing a Greek instrument called the astrolabe. This is a calculator for telling the time of night or day. If it's lined up on a star above the horizon, the angle can be registered with a movable needle. The measurement is then transferred to the reverse side of the astrolabe, where a base plate represents the geographical location. And a star grid, like a map of the heavens, shows the position of the stars. By aligning the needle to the grid using the measurements, the time can be read off the face of the astrolabe, just like a clock. The astrolabe enabled nighttime navigation, which helped to advance sea travel, and this in turn set the stage for the coming era of worldwide exploration and discovery. Cordoban scientists were streets ahead of the rest of Europe, especially when it came to medicine.
This account comes from an Islamic physician who encountered a Christian doctor at work. They brought me a knight who had an abscess on his leg and a woman suffering from consumption. I made a plaster for the knight and the swelling opened and improved. For the woman, I prescribed a diet to revive her consumption. But then the Frankish doctor arrived and objected. "Bring me a strong knight with a well-sharpened battle axe," he said. The knight struck a blow, the marrow of the leg spurted out, and the wounded man died on the spot. As for the woman, their doctor affirmed the devil must have entered her head. Then he grasped a razor and cut an incision in the shape of a cross, exposing the bone of the skull and rubbing salt into the wound. The woman died in the instant. I returned home, having learnt much about the medicine of the Christians.
The hospitals of Cordoba were performing operations which wouldn't be seen in the rest of Europe for hundreds of years. The city's most famous surgeon was a man called Abu Qasis. He spent 40 years compiling a hugely influential medical compendium.
Chapter 30 dealt with surgery, and these are just some of the instruments that were illustrated in that chapter. This is a specialist device used by eye surgeons for the relief of hypertension. And these two over here were employed to perform successful tracheotomies. And in fact, the Abu Qasis method was still popular well into the 20th century.
As well as large scientific collections, more everyday documents have survived from Islamic Cordoba. These give a detailed insight to the society that was created here. What kinds of things are being recorded on these bits of paper?
In this document there was written everything, absolutely everything.
So does that mean that people in the lower classes of society could read?
Yes, there are poor people with a very good education. The education is a way to be a better Muslim. So being a better Muslim means that you know the Quran and you know everything of the law. The law is not a king law. It is the God law.
Divine law.
Divine law.
Have you got any physical examples of these documents?
Yes, I have one. Well, it is a contract about plowing the land. For 2 years, we have to plant it with wheat and food, and he gets from this proportion of the production. The Muslim give a new thing. The land is mine. I rent you the land, and you give me a part of the production. People are interested not in having hunting lands like a lord or squire in England. The landlord rent his land.
And it's empowering as well, because if you're the lowest rung of society and yet you have some rights to your own land and you can keep a lot of the produce.
Yes.
Every piece of evidence from Cordoba adds to the picture of a civilized and highly sophisticated city. It had medical centres, an organised legal system, and libraries full of academics and scientists working on ideas which were light years ahead of anything else in Europe. By the 10th century, Cordoba had become the official capital of Al-Andalus. People flocked here to work, either in the city's shops and markets or on rented land outside. In the year 912, a new ruler came to power. He was to take Cordoba to even greater heights.
Abd al-Rahman III was only 21 when he became ruler of Cordoba. With a resounding statement of self-confidence, he declared himself the Caliph, the commander-in-chief of the faithful. With that title, he claimed to be the supreme leader of the Islamic world. At a stroke, he repositioned Muslim Spain, so it was no longer a Western outpost, but instead a key power in Islam.
And to complement his role as Caliph, Abd al-Rahman III built himself one of the biggest royal palaces in the world. While the English kings of the same period were living in modest wooden halls, Abd al-Rahman III needed 10,000 workmen to construct this enormous palace complex, which was decorated with African white marble. The alabaster palace, surrounded by acres of date palms, was described as a concubine lying in the arms of a black eunuch. It was called Medina al-Zahra, after the Caliph's favourite. Archaeologists have reconstructed barely 10% of the original site.
The idea here is that the Caliph dominates. What he's really doing with the landscape is demonstrating that Medina al-Zahra is the strongest territory in the peninsula. Our excavations reveal the city to be at the cutting edge of technical, architectural, and scientific development. Now, to do this on such an enormous scale requires incredible sophistication. Nothing like this existed in the world.
At the centre of the complex lies Abd al-Rahman's throne room.
What do you think drove Abd al-Rahman to build such an opulent place?
Abd al-Rahman had this built during the last year of his life. It was a symbol of consolidation of his economic and political power. Seated in this throne, the Caliph must have felt himself master of all Al-Andalus's destiny.
Visitors from all over Europe were received here. A monk from Germany called John of Gauss left a record of his trip.
You have to try and imagine the impression this place would have made on John of Gauss. The walls were studded with tiles made of silver and gold, and on the roof there was a massive representation of the heavens. Mechanical lions roared in the corridors, and in the rafters there were mechanical birds that twittered away. Here in the centre of the room, there were two bowls filled with mercury that would catch the light and then send it shattering back out to dazzle the visitors. This is what was written about the climax of his visit. When John arrived at the dais where the Caliph was seated alone, almost like a godhead, he saw everything draped with rare and costly coverings. They do not use thrones or chairs as other people do, but recline on divans or couches when conversing or eating, their legs crossed over one another. There is actually one detail that this account misses out. The Caliph did have a throne, a mechanical throne, that raised and then descended as if he was levitating among his subjects.
A refined court culture developed in the palace of Medina al-Zahra, and this was to have an unexpected influence on the rest of Europe.
What would the soundscapes of the palaces have been in the 10th century?
Perhaps the most basic level would be the sounds of all the different fountains and small running currents, artificial rivers running from room to room. On top of that, we could have heard layer upon layer of different types of music and singing. A variety of different professional instrumentalists. We could easily have heard a lute player sitting in a corner or in any of the various different entryways. There would be a slightly more formal presentation of a singing girl.
What were these singers expected to do? Were they concubines as well?
Well, in some sense, we're doing an injustice by just referring to them as singers. These women were entertainers at every level. They had to be able to converse. They had to be able to discuss intelligent subjects. They had to be able to compose poetry, recite poetry. For Arabs, poetry is the single most important art of their culture. If we look at a picture of the entire world, there are only 3 cultures that we know of that had developed end rhyme by the 7th century: China, India, and the Arabs.
This early Arabic love poetry directly influenced the development of literature in the rest of Europe.
One of the primary characteristics of this poetry is a constant focus on the feelings of the lover. The poet is always complaining of the pangs of love and the distance of the beloved, and we, quite frankly, almost never hear from the beloved.
Love is a welcome malady. Those who are free of it want not to be immune, and those who are stricken want not to be cured.
The pain of separation and unrequited love are concepts that are very familiar to us. And there is a direct connection to that early Arab poetry.
In England, some of our earliest and most enduring stories are romantic tales of knights and damsels, a courtly love tradition brought here by travelling French poets called troubadours.
And those troubadours were inspired by the singing slave girls of Al-Andalus.
The courtly love tradition has long been seen as something European. It came to form the basis of the Western concept of romantic love. But this cornerstone of our culture originated in Islamic Spain.
Perhaps one of the most exciting moments, the transfer, if you will, of Arab music and poetry from the south to the north, happens in the year 1064 in the city of Barbastro.
Neighbouring French knights besiege the city, which falls. Its booty includes hundreds of singing girls who go to the second-in-command, William VIII of Aquitaine.
He would have received a large number of Moorish singing girls, which he then took back with him to France. He died at a fairly young age, and his heir, William IX, inherited this household at age 15. And William IX is known to us in literary history as the first troubadour. So it's almost positive that William IX would not only have grown up as a child in a household in which there were Arab singing girls, but at the age of 15, he actually became their master. It's one of the few moments where we can say that there's a transfer of singing girls from this point to that point, and then the point of reception is precisely where the first flourishing of troubadour poetry emerges.
But the glorious court of Medina al-Zahra was not to last forever. Within the palace were sown the very seeds of its destruction. Abd al-Rahman III had invested much of his money and interest in art and culture, and had paid very little attention to the military. There were no generals at court, and citizens didn't have to serve in the army.
This is important. The mere fact that the army can't recruit from its own citizens means that it has to recruit more and more foreigners, effectively mercenaries. This is part of the reason for the conflict, which led to the ultimate collapse of the caliphate.
When an ambitious courtier usurped the caliphate, the court split into factions. Once the 300-year-old dynasty cracked, it didn't take long for the palace to come under attack. Medina al-Zahra was quickly smashed and plundered.
These are the telltale signs that the palace was violently destroyed. They're scorch marks on the marble made when the molten lead that supported the joist in the roof melted as the palace was burnt to the ground.
Of course, the history of Spain would have been very different if Medina al-Zahra had continued to exist and if the caliphate had not disappeared.
Rahman III's unique dynasty had come to a terrible end.
And in the north of the country, another religious power was eyeing up the rich lands of Al-Andalus. Its name was Christendom.
Al-Andalus's golden age was over. By the beginning of the 11th century, Abd al-Rahman's dynasty in Cordoba had collapsed into chaos and disorder. But what happened next was even more devastating. In 1095, Pope Urban II made a call to arms. He ordered a war to remove Islam from the Holy Lands.
Pope Urban's speech is agitprop at its finest. When an armed attack is made against an enemy, let there be one resounding cry from the soldiers of God. It is the will of God. It is the will of God.
The Crusades had begun. It didn't take long for this zealous warrior mentality to rouse the Christians of northern Spain. And what followed was as treacherous as any of the Crusades in the Holy Lands. The Christians had always held on to the far north of the country, and now they were gaining ground. Al-Andalus had fragmented into a hodgepodge of isolated city-states. Suddenly, Muslim Spain found herself under attack. Her palaces were raided and her cities laid to siege. Between the 11th and the 13th centuries, an army of Christian kings took over the lands of Al-Andalus. Every year, this conflict is reenacted in towns across Spain. This, the victor's version of history, glamorizes what was actually a dishonorable and dirty war.
When the Christian comes, they break everything. They come in summer when it is almost dry. They put it fire. After that, they cut the trees. The agriculture of Al-Andalus was very sophisticated. The more sophisticated is something, the more fragile it is. So the more easy is to break it. Irrigation. If you break a canal, there's no more water. So for some years, people are starving.
So it's a scorched earth policy.
Yes.
Soon, a brutal system of protection rackets emerged.
There is an alternative. You pay me, I don't destroy. I don't burn your house. How much do you give me? I don't cut your trees. How much do you give me? This one. It is a way of the mafia in Chicago. For 1 century, all the 11th century, all the Christian Spain lives at expense of Muslim Spain.
One by one, the fragmented city-states of Al-Andalus were terrorized. Their solution was to fight fire with fire by bringing in troops from Morocco.
This is the capital from the top of a column in Cordoba. It's a buzzing little scene. You've got 4 musicians, 2 who are playing pipes and 2 who are playing the lute. But at some point, the faces of the musicians have been smashed in.
This wasn't perpetrated by Christian raiders. but by the new Muslim power who had come to help Al-Andalus. The troops who came as military support were strict fundamentalists with a fearsome fighting reputation. They were called the Almoravids.
The Almoravids were a tribe of nomads from the Sahara. They had black skin and wore veils that covered everything apart from their eyes. When they went into battle, they rode light-footed, versatile little horses and took with them camels and elephants. But they were fiercest of all when it came to religion. They preached a return to basic Muslim values, and when they came to Al-Andalus, they were shocked by what they found.
There are people from the desert. There is people newborn to the religion, so they have a hard feeling of it.
Evangelical Islam?
Yeah, absolutely. Not accustomed to civilization.
Yeah. What did they think had gone wrong with Islam here?
They felt they have to purify things. They said, this is people very accustomed to civilization, to science. They're talking with Christians, with Jews. This is a mix that we don't like it. We want purified people.
With the barbaric Christian raiders on one side and these new fundamentalist Muslims on the other, Al-Andalus was crushed. It descended into corruption. A Christian king would provide military aid to a weak Muslim king in return for a substantial payment of gold coin. The whole of Al-Andalus was subjected to this system of extortion. The trouble is, modern Spain chooses to remember this war rather differently. La Reconquista, the reconquest, is presented as a valiant crusade in which Spain is returned to its rightful Christian owners. This pantomime version of history is personified in many of Spain's national heroes, the greatest of whom is a knight called Guzman el Bueno. Every town in Spain has a street named after Guzman el Bueno. He's one of the country's best-loved historical figures. The story of when Guzman defended the town of Tarifa from Muslim raids is well known in Spain. Guzman's descendants, the Medina Sidonia family, became one of the richest landowners in the country. The Duchess of Medina Sidonia has discovered something remarkable about her illustrious ancestor.
Guzman el Bueno is the first of the Guzman family we know about. He is the founder of the family. He came here and lived in this very house. This is the family archive, although it's more than that. It is a rich source of documents from the medieval period and later.
Was it right that one of your ancestors was involved in the Spanish Armada?
The seventh Duke was involved in that campaign. This document dates from 1288. We know my ancestor was in Al-Andalus a year before because he bought a farm. And this document mentions it. It's a permit for him to export 300 bushels of wheat. Look, you can see the word wheat. And what it says is that he is allowed to take this overseas, to where he is from.
So, because of the grammar, you can tell that he comes from overseas, not that he was just visiting from overseas.
Yes, probably it refers to a place which was part of Morocco, much larger then than now, a place where neither wheat nor hay could grow.
The Duchess had discovered that her ancestor, the great Christian knight Guzman el Bueno, was actually a Muslim.
This is really a piece of human history. It dates to 1297. The king refers to Guzman as my vassal because he is a foreigner.
Guzman the vassal?
If it wasn't written here, I wouldn't believe it. It was very common for Muslims to ally themselves with Christian factions, especially when Christians were warring with each other.
It must have been quite a surprise to discover that your ancestor was a Muslim.
Yes, a great surprise. This is because there had been a chronicle which dated back to the 16th century, in which the Guzman family had cleaned up its political and ethnic past. Guzman was said to have been born in León. They didn't just do this with the Guzman family, but with all the families that had doubtful ancestors, ancestors of doubtful race. They cleaned it all up. We have a whole load of documents here from the Spanish register, and they turn everything we know about Spanish history upside down. The Spanish are simply inventing history. They have turned history into a fable.
The idea that the Christians and the Muslims were fighting a holy war was created in Spain long after the Reconquest actually took place. Even Spain's most famous hero, the swashbuckling El Cid, is caught up in this fantasy. In films and books, El Cid is celebrated as a kind of Christian pin-up, a crusader in the fight against the terrible Moor. But El Cid spent his life, like El Bueno, as a mercenary, fighting for whomsoever would pay him.
The name Cid means the master in Arabic.
So El Cid's an Arabic name?
Yes. In fact, he was the king of Valencia when Valencia was an Islamic city, and he didn't change anything there.
So he had Muslim allies?
That's it. Yeah.
That's not the story you hear, is it?
No, I think the history is much more interesting than the history you hear.
So he was a Christian king, but he didn't force the Muslims that he controlled to convert?
No, he was... In fact, we cannot see the Reconquest as a process of conversion. This is a process of trial and error, of people gaining lands and people gaining prestige.
It's just realpolitik. It's all about getting land.
That's it. We are painting now everything with an religious ideology, but it's not.
So religion's a kind of convenient excuse rather than the driving force?
Absolutely. Religion is always an excuse.
El Cid and Guzman el Bueno weren't simply Christian soldiers fighting a Muslim enemy. If anything, this was a civil war, with both sides desperately scrabbling for land and wealth.
The idea that the Reconquest was something cut and dried, black and white, something that cleaned up society is absurd. I don't know who came up with that idea.
The Spanish historian Palencia said that the Reconquista was nothing but a civil war between Spaniards of two different faiths.
Spain is full of dazzling reminders of how the righteous Christians won the country back from the diabolical Moor. The country's most popular saint is called Santiago Matamoros, St. James, the Moor Slayer. But this romanticised version of history distorts the true nature of this conflict. This was not a holy war. Al-Andalus was destroyed in a dirty grab for land, which lasted for over 300 years. And in this conflict, the more refined society was the one least equipped for war. It was the Christians who had little to lose and most to gain. And what happened when the Christians began to take over exposes a curious respect for Muslim culture. When the Christian King Peter took control of Seville in 1248, this is what he had made. It is a beautiful building. It was built for a Christian, and yet in every way it resembles an Islamic palace. On the walls there are inscriptions from the Quran, and above the door there are dedications to its owner, calling him Caliph rather than king.
The conqueror has been conquered by the culture.
It's a tiny bit unexpected that when this Christian king rebuilt this palace, he made it appear so Arabic. It feels as if we're in the Alhambra here.
Well, this palace has many relations with the Alhambra, especially with the Court of Lions. Both builders, King Muhammad V of Granada and King Peter I of Castile, were friends. You have to consider that in Europe, at this time, there was not an architecture of such splendor comparable to Al-Andalus. And this made a very big attraction for the Christians. And this is why this architecture was used by the Christian to show to the nobility of the kingdom the power, the authority, this room covered with this marvelous dome. It symbolized a power, because it's the heavens that turns around the king.
But the legacy of Al-Andalus was to affect more than the architecture of Europe. In the midst of this terrible struggle, something incredible was to happen, which would fire the minds of Europeans and expand our intellectual horizons. At the same time that it was being splintered by Christian encroachment, Al-Andalus was at the centre of one of the most influential shifts in thinking that Europe has ever seen. Between the Middle Ages and the modern era, Europe underwent a massive intellectual and cultural revolution. This shift, known as the Renaissance, transformed the human experience. It prompted the exploration of science and the arts and changed the way that men and women saw themselves in relation to God. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed were critical stages in the development of Europe. The origins of the Renaissance are generally believed to lie in Italy, where a renewed interest in the classics had a huge impact on art and culture. But the foundations of the Renaissance were laid much earlier, and not in Italy, but in a town called Toledo in Islamic Spain. Toledo was one of Al-Andalus's vulnerable city-states, and in 1085, the Christians seized control of it. Unusually, the handover went very smoothly, and as a result, the Muslims already living in Toledo were allowed to remain as citizens and their mosques were left untouched. The city that emerged accommodated both Muslim and Christian.
Spain at this time is a paradox. On one hand, tensions between Muslims and Christians are becoming unbearable, and yet on the other, there is a hugely beneficial intellectual evolution that is only possible because Muslims and Christians are living side by side.
When Toledo fell to the Christians, its doors were opened to travellers and intellectuals from all over Europe. These people mixed with the Muslims in the city, learning their language and reading their books. Many of the adventurers came from England.
In the late 1100s, an Englishman known as Daniel of Morley travelled to Europe to study. But as his autobiography reveals, he was disgusted with what he found there. I stopped a while in Paris, and there I saw asses rather than men, pretending to be very important. They had desks in front of them, heaving under the weight of 2 or 3 immovable tomes, but because they did not know anything, they were no better than marble statues. I did not want to get infected by a similar petrifaction, but when I heard that the doctrine of the Arabs was in fashion in Toledo, I hurried there as quickly as I could so that I could hear the wisest philosophers in the world.
Just as the fall of Alexandria had made a massive body of Greek knowledge available to the Arabs 400 years previously, now the Christian conquest of Toledo passed this storehouse of knowledge on to Europeans, who flocked here in their hundreds.
At the backs of shops and in courtyards, groups of men started to gather together, Christians, Muslims and Jews, to work on texts that had been stored in the archives of mosques and churches. These were extraordinary manuscripts, translations of Aristotle and Plato and Euclid, as well as original works by Arabic mathematicians, astronomers and alchemists. This was a resource like no other in the rest of Europe. It was intellectual dynamite.
People came from all over Europe. All these works that were lost in Europe could be found in Toledo. There was lots of wisdom here.
How did the translators work together here in Toledo?
In the first period, there was usually 2 people working together. And then another person who was learned in Latin would write it down in Latin. And that was, I think, the target of working together, and it was very clear. I think it really made it more accurate because it was a teamwork.
How long have these manuscripts been kept in Toledo?
Well, most of the translations were carried out in the 12th and 13th century. That means for almost 900 years, most of them. And here we have the preface in red. That's where we learn about the process of translation. In this case, we read that this book was translated by Gerard of Cremona. It is a medical treatise by Ibn Sina, by Avicenna, and it was translated ab Arabico, from Arabic, in Latinum, into Latin, in Toledo.
Yeah. It's a very rich document, isn't it? You get a sense of how valued these things were.
And there is all these little glosses on the right-hand side. People have been adding comments or explaining words that were not clear. Un momento, por favor. Vamos a...
Wow, that's a splendid beast of a thing.
Yeah.
Is this looks like it's a work of Aristotle, is it?
Yeah, this is the Rhetorica by Aristotle. Rhetorica Aristotelis.
And here we are, look, here's a man who's working on it. Hermanus Alemanus.
Yeah, Herman the German.
Herman the German.
Yeah, even Germans came all the way to Toledo to find all these texts. And in this case, it is a commentary by Averroes on the text of Aristotle. And both are translated together.
So it's got added value because you've got new Arabic thought coming into the classical text.
Yeah, they are adding, they are supplementing, they are completing what was transmitted from the ancient world.
Knowledge really is power at this time in history,
It
isn't
is.
it?
Having a book was something very, very valuable.
Do you find during this process that words slip from one language to another?
Absolutely. Like chemia, that word came into Western languages as chemistry. But we have another word, alchemy, that comes originally from Greek through Arabic. They added the article in Arabic, al, and that gave alchemy.
English is full of words which came into the language from Arabic in this way. Many of them describe mathematical concepts which were completely new to Europe.
Algorithms are named after an Arabic mathematician, and the concept of zero comes from the Arabic sifr, which means empty. It's where we get our word cipher from. But of course, the most obvious and lasting impact is the use of Arabic numerals. And in this Spanish Latin text, which dates from around about 986 AD, we have the first example of Arabic numerals written in Europe. Here they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Imagine trying to do something like multiplication with Roman numerals. Once the numbers get above a certain amount, they are ridiculously unwieldy. This new, agile numerical system made everyday things like bookkeeping and accounting more accessible. Mathematics developed, and the construction of complex architectural projects became much easier. Recently, archaeologists renovating the roof timbers of Salisbury Cathedral in England made a discovery which clarifies this story.
On some of the beams that support the roof, there were a series of numbers that were carved in around 1200 AD when the cathedral was built. Now, that's a 3, and obviously it's familiar to us today, but in its time, it was a curious and progressive symbol.
At this time, everyone in England was still using the clunky old Roman numerals, but here in the rafters of one cathedral, a new trend appears to have caught on.
These numbers, the numbers that we use today, the fact that they're here is proof that the ordinary craftsmen who carved them benefited from an explosion of knowledge that started in Arabia and spread through Europe via Islamic Spain.
And the travellers from Toledo brought more than just practical knowledge back to England.
After a number of years, Daniel of Morley returned from Toledo, his cases crammed with documents and volumes. And when he arrived in England, he made an appointment to hand this precious booty over to his patron, who was a bishop. This benefactor was one of a team of scholars who wanted to establish their town as a centre of learning. And the name of the town was Oxford.
The universities that were founded in Paris, Bologna and Oxford at this time based their new curriculum on the radical ideas which were pouring out of Toledo.
One of Daniel of Morley's compatriots, a man called Adelard of Bath, published this volume just after he got back from Toledo. It's a collection of 76 very basic questions, like why is the sea salty? Why are there tides? How does the globe hang in the air? And do animals have souls? The questions are seemingly simple, but they embody a new spirit of rational inquiry, where a blind faith in God is challenged. And Adelard of Bath admits his debt to the Muslims in pursuing this line of inquiry. He writes, "From the Arabs I have learnt one thing, to lead by reason. I will detract nothing from God, but very carefully listen to the limits of human knowledge. Only where this utterly breaks down should we refer things to God."
The Muslims developed a massive program of translations in which they translated from Greek into Arabic everything that had reached them. And this was something that was promoted by the whole society. And the result of this is that they translated practically all Greek knowledge. There is a first period in which they translate and they learn, they assimilate. Later, they had learned enough and they began to produce original works by themselves and to criticize Greek science. And of course, one cannot say that the Arabs were mere transmitters of Greek science. They were the people that continued the work of Greek scientists until they led all this research into a final crisis. And this final crisis was the crisis that brought the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. If they had not done this, Renaissance and scientific revolution would have been impossible.
It would take time for these groundbreaking ideas to become assimilated into Christian Europe. But once they were, Western intellect was transformed. The works of Aristotle were taught in the new universities. The medical treatises of Avicenna were used in hospitals. And Arabic translations of Greek geometry and those new Arabic numerals were passed on to craftsmen and architects. This was a critical stage in the growth of Western thought. We should no longer see the Renaissance as a rebirth, but the continuation of an intellectual movement which had been nourished centuries earlier by Muslims.
The Italian Renaissance is famous for reviving classical learning, but in fact what's happening here 400 years earlier seems to be just as vital. Do you think that Muslim scholars aren't given due credit for what they're doing in Islamic Spain at this time?
It is not something that you would learn about in school, probably, or even at university. It was probably conscious process of neglect, and now we are still suffering from that.
Extremely selective history writing.
That's right. It is due to the conflict that existed between the two worlds.
These remarkable ideas were leaching out of Al-Andalus at precisely the same time that the Christians were flooding in. The frontier, which had started far north of Madrid, was gradually pushing southwards. Then, in 1236, Cordoba fell, followed by Valencia and Seville, until by 1250, only the Kingdom of Granada remained Muslim. From now on, Spain would concentrate on cleaning the Muslim presence from its country.
The Islamic influence on Europe has been quietly laid down, but when it came to the physical expulsion of the Muslims from Spain, that would be an act that was anything but subtle. It was shocking and absolute.
The history of Al-Andalus was about to take a new and sinister turn. In the city of Granada, the Muslims were to fall victim to one of the most shocking acts of ethnic cleansing that Europe has ever seen.
Long after the rest of Al-Andalus had fallen to the Christians, Granada remained defiantly Islamic. Protected by mountains and those giant watchtowers and forts, the 70,000 Muslims who lived here managed to hold off attack for another 200 years. But time was running out.
While Granada occupied a small territory in the south of Spain, the rest of the country was now divided between Castile in the west and Aragon in the east, two very powerful kingdoms. The King of Castile was about to be forced to pass his kingdom to his niece, Isabella.
Isabella was headstrong and passionate, but she also had an acute political mind. In 1469, at the age of 18, she married her second cousin, Ferdinand, the dashing heir to the throne of Aragon. Now, the two most powerful Catholic dynasties in Spain were united, and the reconquest was edging ever closer to completion.
Granada was blocking Isabella's vision of a unified Spain, and so it had to be reclaimed. The city was laid to siege for a year before it finally surrendered.
On the 1st of January 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, dressed in elaborate Moorish outfits, which they'd had especially made. With great pomp and circumstance, they entered the Palace of Alhambra and took the keys to the city. As the Muslim ruler Boabdil left in tears, it was said that his mother spat out at him, "Do not weep like a woman for that which you cannot defend like a man."
Isabella's victory in Granada put an end to an incredible society. In the 700 years that they'd been in Europe, the Muslims of Al-Andalus had built a culture which was the very pinnacle of civilized life, influencing Europe in ways that we're only just beginning to understand. And Isabella would endeavour to ensure that Islam in the West would never enjoy such a relationship again.
A few years after Ferdinand and Isabella came to power, they set up an organisation that affected the most extreme form of religious control that Europe has ever known.
The Inquisition.
The purpose of the Inquisition was to track down and eliminate anyone who wasn't an Orthodox member of the Catholic Church.
Those found guilty of heresy were subjected to a sinister public ceremony called an auto de fe. In this eerie ritual, vestiges of which are still performed today, the guilty were forced to repent their sins while their accusers watched on, hidden under hooded caps. The sinners were then detained. Some were burnt at the stake. Most had their homes and livelihoods taken from them. In 1526, the Spanish Inquisition came to Granada to deal with the Muslim problem. Muslims were labelled heretics and given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism, leave the country, or be punished. The Muslims of Granada were segregated from the rest of the population. Their ghetto survives as the old quarter of the city today.
It's a fantastic house. Thank you.
Many of the houses that the Muslims were forced out of are still standing. Antonio Orihuela lives in one.
It's almost inverted, because you don't have any windows looking out onto the street, but the focus is in the middle here on the courtyard.
Yes, the courtyard is the center of the family life. So all the doors and windows are open to the courtyard and closed to the street. Privacy was one of the most important characteristics of these houses. Outside the house, they were Christian. They went to the church with the priest. They celebrate the wedding in the Christian way, but then later they came home to celebrate again the wedding in the Muslim style.
And what happened though when the Inquisition came knocking on the door?
Well, as you see, these houses had the bent entry. So from outside, even if the door is open, it's not possible to see what happens in the courtyard.
The Inquisitors went from door to door, seeking out those they still suspected of being Muslim. A number of civic leaders had already been expelled, and so often it was only women and children left. They herded them up and held them in churches by night so that they could be tried the following morning. Some of the women cried out that they were like lambs being taken to the slaughter and wished that instead they'd been allowed to die in their own home.
The Inquisition was so brutally efficient that within 20 years, all Muslims in Spain had been forcibly converted to Catholicism. But this wasn't enough. Many still continued to practice their faith in private. And so, in 1609, the Spanish crown ordered the removal of all Muslims from Spain.
Perhaps the most shocking thing in the expulsion is they were not actually expelling Arabs, nor were they expelling Berbers. The huge majority of the people that were being expelled by blood, by DNA, if you will, were as Iberian as their Christian cousins in the north who were kicking them out of the peninsula. It's really it's an enormously different vision of what the expulsions were and what they meant when we realize that the people who were being thrust out were as native to the peninsula as the Christian kings.
Why do you think the Catholic authorities felt they had to expel the Moors in 1609?
The Spanish Empire, for it was indeed by then the empire, simply felt pressed in so many different directions. They were very much afraid of the Turks, who were in fact raiding from North Africa and raiding along the southern coast of Spain. They were fighting wars still in the Americas. It was one internal problem that they simply could not deal with any longer.
In 10 years, over 250,000 Muslims were expelled from Spain. Forbidden to take any possessions with them, most sought refuge in North Africa.
When Isabella and Ferdinand died, this is where they were buried. It's a little corner of the Alhambra, and it's decorated with inscriptions from the Quran. They read, "There is no true God but Allah." In many ways, it's a curious choice for a Christian entombment, but it does speak of that complicated relationship that was enjoyed by the Catholics and the Muslims. On one level, it says that Isabella and Ferdinand were still half in love with all things Islamic, but on the other, it's a bold and uncompromising statement of control.
And in Cordoba, the new Catholic rulers did something unbelievable. In a daring act of what can only be described as inspired vandalism, architects gouged out the centre of the mosque. In its place, built one of the most spectacular cathedrals in Spain. The result is a shocking and blasphemous conflation of two of the world's most powerful religions. It is unnervingly beautiful, but possesses an underlying schizophrenia, as if a terrible and silent battle is being carried out in the very architecture of the building. Spain's troubled relationship with its Muslim past continued into the 20th century. The dictator Franco invented his own version of his country's heritage.
Franco, this period was somehow interrupting what was for him a continuum history. He wanted somehow to, if not delete it, he wanted to forget about it. So what he did was to explain the whole Muslim or the whole Al-Andalus as a kind of continuum from the Visigothic period to the Catholic kings, by saying that the Muslims in Al-Andalus were not such big, good Muslims, but much more Christianized. So this is the political use of history. He wanted to explain the identity of being Spaniards.
And for Franco, that identity was a continuation from the Visigothic period right through to the Catholic period.
Yeah, exactly.
Serafin Fanjul is an academic whose books on the history of Al-Andalus are bestsellers in Spain.
Do you think that Spanish people today are proud at all of the Arabic episode in their history, or are they ashamed of it?
No, not at all. Strictly speaking, it's not our past. It's the past of other people. As a modern-day Spaniard, I would feel very little connection with the Arab past. Spanish people don't live like them. We don't dress like them. We don't feel like them. I don't know how you can say we are the same, because we are not the same. We have nothing in common. Nothing in common. And if I weren't a professor of Arabic studies, I would have absolutely no feeling for Muslim culture.
For a very long time, people have protested and urged that history be truthfully told, that they not be fed this nonsense. But this is the inheritance of the Inquisition. The Inquisition's character is alive and well. I can tell you one thing. Spanish people have a tendency to prevent others from speaking their minds, a tendency to try and control the way others behave and think. You can be sure that when you try and speak the truth, you pay for it.
And so Al-Andalus fell. East became East, and West became West. Two distinct cultures, politically and religiously divided. And yet, what the history of the Moors shows is that these two cultures are also linked in ways that we might never have imagined. The West has been inspired by Islam, but more than that, it was in the very act of fighting the Muslims that Europe consolidated its identity.
When we started, Christopher Columbus was setting sail for the New World. And as he pointed his boats westwards, Spain aligned herself with him, turning away from the East. The Muslims had been fought, and now they were to be forgotten. As time went by, memories of the Islamic past were moulded until they became a more comforting storybook version of history. But this is a case where truth really is stranger than fiction. The story of Al-Andalus isn't a simple tale of good versus bad, East versus West. It's intriguing and complicated, it's brilliant and brutal, it's very human and it's very messy, and it's for precisely that reason that it needs to be remembered, not written out of the history books.
Well, if you want to know more about the many cultures that have shaped and changed Britain, visit Origination Insight at channel4.com/culture. Coming up next on 4, Father Ted is tempted by a saucy novelist.